Welcome to our program this evening. I'm Casey Vance. I'm the Executive Director at the Historical Society. This is the third lecture in our 2018 series, and we're again fortunate to have our Historical Society volunteer Kathy Speck organize this outstanding series of programs. And we're also fortunate to be partnering with the Ames Public Library to present the lecture series. If you haven't yet stopped across the street at the History Center to see our current exhibit, Ames High, Aiming High Through the Years, I encourage you to do so. Since the bond referendum was recently passed to build a new Ames High, it's especially pertinent. And the History Center is open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 4. Another upcoming event is May 15th at 7 o'clock, again here in the auditorium. We will have a lecture outside of the lecture series. Jeff Stein will present Making Waves, the People and Places of Iowa Broadcasting. He'll especially talk about the Floppy Show, which he's just written a book about, and he'll have books and CDs available for purchase at the lecture. And actually our door prize drawing for tonight is his book, The Floppy Show, which was just recently published. So make sure you sign up for that if you haven't already. Then the next lecture in our lecture series is May 23rd at 7 o'clock, again here at the auditorium. And that one is Peopling Iowa, First Generation Immigrants in Story County, presented by another Iowa State faculty member, Mark Barron. At this time, I ask that you turn off all cell phones and other electronic devices if you haven't already done so. We do have assistive listening devices available if you need one. Please let us know if we can help you with that. And we want to recognize and thank those of you who are currently members of the Historical Society. We couldn't do the things we do without your support. About 25% of our funding comes from members. And if you're not a member, we do have some brochures available on the table over there if you're interested. Memberships are critical to providing day-to-day service to the community, to our ability to preserve archives and artifacts, and to provide programs such as we have tonight. And now I'll turn it over to Kathy to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Our speaker tonight is on the faculty at Iowa State, Pam Riney-Kehrberg, is a historian whose research focuses on the American rural and agricultural history, as well as the history of childhood and youth and the family. Although most of her recent work has been in the time period from 1870 to 1945, actually she's shifted a little bit, and most of her recent projects are a little more contemporary. She is the author of 4 books: Rooted in Dust, Surviving Drought and Depression in Southwestern Kansas; Childhood on the Farm, Work, Play, and Coming of Age in the Midwest; Always Plenty to Do, Growing Up on the Farm in the Long Ago, this book for young readers; The Nature of Childhood and Environmental History of Growing Up in America Since 1865. She's also the editor of 2 books, Waiting on the Bounty, The Dust Bowl Diary of Mary Nackstedt Dick, and the Rutledge History of Rural America. She's published nearly 40 articles and book chapters, and her current research focuses on the history of the rural and small town in the Midwest, particularly small town Iowa. That interest has led her to a book project tentatively titled When a Dream Dies: Agriculture, Identity, and the Farm Crisis of the 1980s. And she mentioned she's going to be intensely working on that topic this summer. She's also enjoyed consulting on historical projects, many of which tie into her research interests. One of those consulting topics included helping Ken Burns with his documentary, The Dust Bowl. So please welcome Pam Riney-Kehrberg.
Thank you, everybody. I'm very glad to be here this evening. You are going to have to forgive me. I'm about 4 days past the flu. So I've got a runny nose, and I'm probably going to be doing a little coughing, but hopefully it will hold off until all of this is over. I'm really excited to be talking with you about this research. I am writing a book about Iowa in the farm crisis of the 1980s, and one of my goals is to make this a story of as much of the state as possible, which means that I'm writing about adults. I'm writing about men who farm, women who farm, small town people. I'm also writing about young people. and their experiences of the 1980s. And I think it's really important to include them in the story. Why? Well, I believe that the history of the lives of teenagers has value in itself. They're part of our culture. And if you leave out children and young adults, you're leaving out a big part of the story, because these people grow up. And the experiences of their teen years can have a really profound effect on the choices they make as adults. I think it is no coincidence that a large number of the young people who went through the 1980s in our small towns and on our farms in this state are no longer in this state. The experience of the 1980s was a very, very difficult one, and one that left a lot of scars, and I think you'll see that as I talk about some of the yearbooks here. And the 1980s, of course, with the farm crisis, completely reshaped Iowa. There were enormous budget cuts, there was the loss of factories, severe damage to small towns and to farms, and a lot of trauma that it inflicted on people of all ages. And in order to tell the story of that time, I want to tell the story of everyone, as much as possible, who went through that time. Now, studying teenagers can be a little bit on the difficult side. The grown-ups leave more records. Teenagers are a little harder to get at. You can look at magazines for teenagers, but those, of course, are written by grown-ups. You can look at advice for teenagers, but of course that's given by grown-ups. Advertising meant for teenagers, they're trying to tie into teen culture, but again, more grown-ups there. All kinds of media that addresses teenagers. We can, of course, do oral histories with people who were once teenagers, and that is a really good source of information to ask them to go back to their teenage years. When I worked on the history of teenagers, say 100 years ago, I had access to a lot of letters and diaries, but the people who are teenagers in the 1980s haven't handed over their materials yet. And so it hasn't gotten to the Historical Society yet. So I was thinking about, well, how do I capture what happened with these teens in the 1980s? And I thought, by teenagers, about teenagers. And I thought, yearbooks, high school yearbooks. They're one of the very few sources that we have that are indeed by teenagers, for teenagers. And so I began looking at high school yearbooks. And high school yearbooks have some really wonderful strengths. As I said, they're by students, for students. They're available for most high schools, not for all of them, but for most of them. And I've had pretty good luck finding yearbooks when I've gone out there to find them. They're important enough to be saved. People cared about their yearbooks, and so there's actually quite a stock of them. It's much harder to find student newspapers. A lot of those were not saved. Sometimes they were run as columns in the local newspaper, but they're much more ephemeral. And yearbooks, I think more than a lot of other kinds of sources, do make an attempt to include everybody. At the very least, they try to have at least one picture of everybody. Now some people, of course, get much more coverage than others, the cheerleaders, the football team, the basketball team, but still, there's some attempt to get everybody in there. But there are problems with yearbooks as well. It's kind of hard to know what role the yearbook sponsor took. There's always a faculty member who was the sponsor for the yearbook, and it's hard to know how heavy that person's hand was. Were there things that they did not want the students to say? Were there things they wanted the students to say? We don't know exactly what the role of the teacher was, although I've got one example in here that I think indicates that sometimes sponsors aren't paying attention. There's also a real variety of yearbooks. There's the old style yearbook, which basically is just the facts yearbook. Those are the ones where there's the pictures of the various classes, there are the pictures of the various student activities, but there's not a whole lot of editorial in them. That's why I would call it an old-style yearbook. But even so, you can find lots of material in those. You can look at the pictures of the teams and find out who was included and who was not included. Sometimes the students were allowed to list their likes and their dislikes, their favorite hobby, the things that I was looking through my father's yearbook from the 1950s from a small city in Kansas. And the students were allowed to list what they were fond of. And what I discovered by looking at the list of things that people were fond of was that there were several of the women who were married, and there was, in fact, the mother of a 2-year-old in my father's high school class in 1957, which I thought was pretty darn progressive of this small city in Kansas in the 1950s. So you can find out things. There's depths in there. And then there, of course, there are the new style yearbooks, which you really start seeing in the late 70s, early 80s, where there's a lot of color. There are lots and lots of comments. They editorialize about everything. They try to be literary. Sometimes they're very successful at doing that. The Ames High yearbooks, definitely, the ones from the 80s, fall into that category. And that difference in style also goes along a bit with differences in budget. You can tell what schools had a lot of money. Again, lots of color, lots of pages, lots of innovation, covers that are really quite stylish. You can tell what schools had money. But that's useful information as well. Something else I discovered that I really wasn't expecting was that high school yearbooks are targets for vandals. There are an awful lot of them that are kept under lock and key. These ones from our library here are kept in a locked room. And I was talking with a librarian about that, and she said, yes, they're the single most stolen item, or they were the single most stolen item in the library until they moved them into the locked room. And then I started flipping through the pages, and there's holes. And I thought, what's going on here? And again, talked with the librarian some, and decided, she and I came to the conclusion that either people were cutting out their younger, less attractive selves, or they were cutting out their exes. And so high school yearbooks are really heavily vandalized. And so that also was interesting. But it does mean that sometimes you have incomplete yearbooks there. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem that that can be helped. I was looking at a number of yearbooks in a locked room in Webster City, in their beautiful, beautiful Iowa room. And we discovered while I was there that one of the yearbooks had been stolen out of the locked room. So these things they're just magnets. And, it's a horrible thing. I get very upset when books get vandalized and stolen, but it's a reality of working with yearbooks. Now, even though there are problems with yearbooks as sources, there are fantastic sources. This would be the point where my undergraduate students would say, well, what am I supposed to do? There's problems with the source. And, well, you use it anyway, because there are so few sources about young people. And they're marvelous. And I have discovered some really exciting things looking at these high school yearbooks from the 1980s. I have discovered these are the primary preoccupations of teenagers in the 1980s. These are the comments that show up in yearbook after yearbook. It does not matter if it's rural or urban, poor district, rich district, doesn't matter. These are the things that come up. Ames does not admit to cruising, okay? Virtually every other set of high school yearbooks has references to cruising, dating, alcohol, popular culture, money, meaning after-school jobs, and the image of the school. All of these things show up in these various yearbooks. Cruising, this is from the Boone High School Toreador from 1980. How did they end up the Toreadors? This is local history, I do not know. But at any rate, cruising out of control, pictures of all guys with their cars, and a discussion of going out on Friday night and cruising up and down. Edie, do you know someone there?
Charlotte Brown, Angie Mateo, and that top one. Oh my God.
Your life in pictures. At any rate, I forget which town it was called. Scooping the Loop. There are terms for it in every location. Where is Scooping the Loop? Fort Dodge. Okay. Yep. They're Scooping the Loop. Everybody has a nickname for it. And it seems pretty universal. Like I said, they didn't admit to it in Ames. Maybe it wasn't cool enough. The young folks over in Nevada talked about coming to Ames to cruise or going all the way to Boone to cruise because their little strip got a bit short after a while, so they had to go in search of other places to cruise. Dating. Ames Spirit, 1986, talking about a boy's eye view of perfect dates, which is a tiny bit deceptive because an awful lot of this article is about being too scared to ask girls on dates. But it does talk about the perfect date being, going out for pizza at Pizza Pit, going to a movie, finding the right girl. And again, you see these all over the place, although this being Ames, they decided to do the boy's eye view, which is a little bit different. Also from the Ames Spirit, drinking. Lots and lots of discussion of illegal drinking. 1987 was right after the drinking age in Iowa was raised from 18 to 21. And so this article is about how even though the drinking age has changed, everybody's still drinking. And Ames High was a little on the daring side. We'll talk about more about that in a moment. But there's a lot of reference to illegal drinking, how readily available alcohol was, and if you were a parent of a person who went to Ames High in the 1980s, they were buying their alcohol at the gas station. That is where they were doing most of their buying, it says. But it said that of 146 students that they surveyed, 63% of them said that they drank regularly. So I kind of wonder how many parents read the yearbook and cringed. Okay, pop culture. They almost always have a page where they talk about their favorite things, where they list their favorite food, which is always pizza. They list their favorite actors and actresses, which are different in different places. Here we have Burt Reynolds and Sally Field. Their favorite teams, their favorite music. It was really interesting. Up in Roland's story, they listed their favorite music, but I found it very interesting that they bothered to list that the students' favorite artists were, I think, Journey and AC/DC, but the parents' favorites were John Mellencamp and Willie Nelson, who, of course, were doing Farm Aid concerts in the 1980s. So I had not seen that in anybody else's yearbook. But in Roland's story, they also wanted to give their parents a little bit of time. You never know what you're going to find with pop culture. I love this. I did not expect, I will out myself here. I am not from Iowa. I grew up in a suburb of Denver. Prince was very, very popular when I was in high school and in college. And I wasn't expecting to see him so very, very popular in rural Iowa. But here we have the Nevada Cub 1985 Purple Rain, the Purple Rain edition. That was the title of Prince's album that was out that year, was Purple Rain. And then a Prince impersonator there on the facing page. Not what I was expecting at Nevada High School. But I thought, I really liked seeing that. Okay, money. Part-time jobs. Students spend a lot of time in the yearbook complaining that their parents don't give them enough money and that they have to work for it. And so they spend a lot of time talking about their part-time jobs. Although there is always a place in there where they talk about how fun their part-time jobs are too. So they complain a little bit, but then they say that they're learning something from what they're doing and they're enjoying it. And then there's the whole issue of image. Students care a whole lot about the image of their high school. They care a whole lot about what other people think of their high school. North Scott High School is in far eastern Iowa. It's near the Quad Cities. And in 1988, one of the DJs at a Quad Cities station referred to North Scott as Cal Pi High. They were angry enough that they made a big deal of it at their homecoming game and then made sure that it made it into the yearbook. They were proud of being rural, but that did not mean that they wanted to be called Cal Pi High. And so they were making a big deal about who they were and what they cared about, and they cared about their image. So these are the issues that I kept seeing over and over and over again as I made my way through the yearbooks. But what I was looking for was not so much, whether they liked cruising or not, or whether they went to Cal Pi High. What I really wanted to see was how were they assimilating the incredible trouble that Iowa was experiencing in the 1980s. Were they aware of the farm crisis? Were they aware of the turmoil that was going on down at the State House? Was all of this soaking into their young consciousnesses, and in what form? And what I discovered was that yes, indeed it was, but how young people assimilated it depended very much on where they lived. That's obvious. Different communities have different concerns. And the range of concerns that you see expressed in yearbooks is very broad. And I've pulled out 4 that I think are particularly useful for explaining this. One of them will be, of course, the Ames High Spirit. But there's a real range of responses and a lot of real thoughtfulness. That was what impressed me. These are teenagers, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, who are being very, very thoughtful about what this moment meant for their community, their high school, their state. And I found it a much richer set of responses than I was necessarily expecting. We can know the teen experiences in the 1980s went a whole lot deeper than cruising. So one of the high school yearbooks I found that I really found interesting was Ottumwa. Ottumwa is a small industrial city. The students' concerns were not about farms, as you wouldn't necessarily expect an urban high school, their students would be concerned about farms. Instead, Ottumwa's young people were concerned about what's going on in industry in the state in the 1980s. The farm crisis meant that their parents were losing jobs. And they wrote about that in their yearbook. Their yearbook also was one of the ones where you could tell that it was not a prosperous community. It was yearbook without color. Very drab. I think they had kind of an uninspiring sponsor, who I hope isn't in this room. I'm assuming he's not in this room. An uninspiring sponsor who perhaps wasn't encouraging them to innovate, but still, you start looking, and you see lots of evidence of the troubles of the 1980s in their yearbook. Right there in the Argus in 1984, they let the readers know that Ottumwa is someplace special, but it's also a place where bad things are happening. There are massive layoffs at the John Deere plant and the Hormel plant in 1984. And they're letting the reader know that, yeah, there are a lot of fathers, in particular mothers as well, who are without jobs as a result of what is happening in the economy in the state. They're aware that the 1980s were kind of heavy years, a lot of difficult things going on. Interestingly enough, they start with talking about the farm crisis. But at at kind of a strange distance. They're talking about the farm crisis almost as if it's happening somewhere else. Farmers across the country, they say, are experiencing difficulties in the 1980s. They're in this particular year in 1986. It's the height of the farm crisis. But they don't refer to the fact that perhaps it is people who are very, very close to them who might be the people who are experiencing this. Instead, they hone in more on other issues that are happening. There's a discussion of AIDS, the AIDS crisis. There's a discussion of the Tylenol poisonings that happened in the mid-1980s. There's a discussion of the Challenger disaster, which of course lots and lots of young people saw broadcast on TV in their classrooms, which meant that it comes up a lot in the yearbooks. And then they also discuss the earthquake, the big earthquake in Mexico City. So there's a discussion of a number of different problems, but I found them kind of detached about the whole issue of the farm crisis. One other thing I probably should have mentioned was that it was almost a requirement that there be, no matter how bare bones the yearbook, at least one page where they talked about current events and had some pictures of newsmakers and some discussion like this about what the big stories were. I think Prince William would be incredibly surprised to discover how many high school yearbooks in America have his baby pictures in them. For some reason, Princess Diana and the birth of Prince William were all over high school yearbooks in Iowa. But there's always a page like that. And here's where they discussed in the Ottumwa Argus what was happening around the world, around the United States. I really liked this because this was a visual depiction in 1989 of all of the many problems there were lurking out there in the world at this point. Very nice little artistic depiction. They begin with drought in Iowa, so they're very clearly responding to what's happening at the edge of town there. AIDS, starvation in Africa, terrorism, Libya in particular, environmental issues, pollution in particular, and the crack cocaine epidemic. So someone has thought very carefully here about what the big concerns are in that year, and they've done a lovely, lovely set of pictures here. And it was just sort of tucked into the book, but you could tell they were thinking. Now, here we get to Ames. Of course, Ames is a college town, and the high school yearbook here really reflected the students' preoccupation with the state budget. This was a community where there were lots of college-bound young people who were very, very concerned that what was happening in Des Moines was going to mean that they were going to lose programs, that they were not going to be able to participate in everything they wanted to participate in high school. So they were very, very concerned about the state of the economy, but not so concerned about the farm crisis. The farm crisis just sort of, right on through. They don't even really much notice, but they do notice that the state is in a financial crisis and that it is affecting them. So, 1982, there's an article called Budgets Cut and Stores Closed, which talks about the loss of various businesses at the beginning of the 1980s. It does talk about some other businesses opening, but on the whole, it's about business losses. And then this story over the cost rose due to cuts is about lunches and about how disgusting the lunches are becoming now that there have been budget cuts and you can't have as many desserts, and where they're really feeling the budget cuts in 1982 is in the lunch line, and they don't like it. But the problems continue in 1983. And in 1983, they threatened to cut the band program, and they did have cuts to the driver's ed program. Band, of course, affected a large number of students. In the end, they were able to get by without doing much cutting, but they did have to reshuffle the driver's ed program. And that was really upsetting to the students because they had to have driver's ed before they could get their licenses. And it meant that some of them might have to delay getting their driver's licenses, which for a 16-year-old is a big deal. You know, parents would say, just go get on a bus, you know, ride your bike, whatever. But to a 16-year-old, it's a really big deal. And then in 1985, it was orchestra, which was potentially on the block. It survived the cut. They did not end up cutting the program, but again, there's this bubbling fear underneath the surface that things are going to change. And they're going to change in a bad way. And they're not happy about this. There's a whole lot of stress that's very apparent in these yearbooks. There's a lot of excitement, but there's also a whole lot of stress because students were very aware of what might be cut next. This I find very interesting. It's basically about an article about leaving Ames. A few of them admit that they are planning on staying in this area to go to college because they want to stay close to family or want to stay close to friends. But it is largely a discussion of getting out. Living in the heartland of America with a view of amber rows of corn and the pungent odor of pigs tended to get old after living with it for so many years. So they're going to leave Iowa. Now I find interesting, and Dr. Hollander, you might be able to comment on this. One of the young people here says they're going to the University of Chicago because it's a party school. I somehow think they were probably sorely disappointed when they got there, since it sounds like it was a studying school. But at any rate, there's a discussion of where they're going, and for a lot of them, it's any place but here, which I think is a very natural response of 18-year-olds. But it was interesting seeing that. Now, I do think that the Ames High yearbooks show a little bit more of something, and it doesn't surprise me, a little bit more of something than I see in the other yearbooks, and that seems to be a desire to shock, or perhaps a desire to be avant-garde, or a desire to show that they are at the cutting edge. It's a college town, and so there is much more discussion of illegal drinking than you see in other places, including the survey that I told you about where they went out and found out from their peers how many of them were drinking. There's a discussion of going to X-rated movies. There is a whole article in one of the early 1980s yearbooks about what do they call it? The benefits or the just a minute here. I'm trying to remember the exact wording, how they put it. The privileges of being over 18. And of course, in the early 1980s, when they ran this particular article, they could still drink. They wrote about going to X-rated movies and said, no big deal. You wouldn't want to go anyway. And about signing up for the draft. And commented that this was not a privilege, it was something they were forced to do. In the later 1980s, there's a discussion of abortion rights. And I have not seen that in any other yearbook that I've looked at. Homosexuality. In the middle of the 1980s, there were 2 students at Ames High School who came out. And there was, in fact, an assembly about it and a debate about it, which they reported in the yearbook. Also in the late 1980s, the district adopted an AIDS policy because, of course, that was an era when there was a lot of discrimination against people who had AIDS, and the district adopted a policy that said that any student, as well as the siblings of students with AIDS, would be allowed to go to Ames High School and would be treated respectfully. But they chose to talk about all of this in the yearbook, which I found very interesting. Even the Iowa City yearbooks are not quite as out there as Ames is. And I'm not quite sure why. I think I would have expected to see at least as much in Iowa City, being another university town, but it was particularly visible in Ames. Which is not to say that it's not visible in other places. This is, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Rocky Horror Picture Show, cult movie, featuring a transvestite and lots of sexual, very, very heavy sexual innuendo. The kind of movie that most parents, I know my parents in the late 1970s, early 1980s did not want me to go to this movie, and I went anyway. But at any rate, this was the cover of the Regina High School yearbook in 1985. It's a Catholic high school. You know, I also told you I wasn't always sure that sponsors were paying attention. Did the sponsor know what Rocky Horror was when they allowed the students to put this on the front of their yearbook? Probably not. Or else, because I'm sure it was Sister Mary someone or other who thought, oh, it's just, you know, it's a slasher movie. No. But at any rate, it was a movie-themed yearbook, and they chose this for their cover, and I thought, sneaky. I mean, their yearbook was so tightly laced and careful, and here we are with this cover, which I just loved. There are all kinds of interesting things going on there. There are all kinds of other under-the-surface stories going on in other places in Iowa. Stratford, north and west of here, a very small town. Stratford, Iowa, is an even smaller town now, of course, than it was in the 1980s. If you opened up their yearbook, the senior class easily fit inside the front cover. They would always take a picture of all of them standing together and put it inside the front cover. Found a nice pretty place to picture of everybody, easily fit there. Well, during the 1980s, it became apparent that their high school might not survive the economic problems of the decade. And I found a really interesting yearbook in 1986, in fact, their last yearbook, which took on this whole question of uncertainty. They did not know going into that year, they did not know at the end of that year if their high school was going to survive. And they found the most clever way of dealing with that. It was the year of the comet. It was the year Halley's Comet came back. So they tell us the tale of the comet. 1986, the year of the comet. Yes, this is the year of Halley's Comet, which completes its orbit once every 76 years and shows itself to us, the inhabitants of Earth. People sometimes blame the comet for natural disasters that happen during the year. They're anticipating disaster. They say that it could be good, it could be bad. Comets have been blamed for military defeats or credited with victories. So they're saying it could go either way. It's an uncertain time. Our high school is potentially, they don't say this, the subtext is our high school is potentially on the chopping block. We don't know. But by making the comet the center of their story, it could go either way. Which is what this says as well. If you look across the top where it says school board, thumbs up, thumbs down. I didn't notice that the first time until I went back and looked at it again. It says that there have been additional closed-door meetings of the school board throughout the year. And it could go either way. They say they're discussing the future of our school. So what did the comet foretell? Well, as I said, that was their last yearbook. We find the answer to what happened in the Webster High School torch in 1988. 43 new students enrolled. A huge number of new students at the Webster City High School. Now, 4 of those new students were foreign exchange students. The 39 others were the students from Stratford's high school. They lost their high school. And what it says is that the seniors were expecting to graduate from their own school, and ended up graduating from Webster City's high school instead. They try and end on a positive note. They say, Senior Jennifer Lundberg expressed her view of the change in this way: it's bigger. There are more students, faculty, and more opportunities. I really enjoy it here. The view was shared by many of her fellow students. I have a feeling, though, that an awful lot of them would have preferred to graduate from their own high school and not from Webster City's high school. But I felt like these students were finding a really interesting way of dealing with the complexities of losing their school without coming out and saying it. You could tell that that was what was preoccupying them, but they don't come right out and say it. Then there's my very favorite yearbook that I found. From Harlan, Iowa, way out in Shelby County, far western part of the state. Shelby County in the 1980s was in the midst of the farm crisis. They were being battered by the farm crisis. According to the editor, and I found the editor of the 1985 Harpoon, Harlan Harpoon. She and the other people on the yearbook that year wanted to tell the real story of what was happening at their high school. Things were really bad. They didn't want to just talk about how great the football team was. They didn't just want to talk about victories here and prom there. They wanted to talk about how much all of this hurt. Now, they had been the summer before to the Iowa Writers Workshop. There was a yearbook editors workshop that was part of the Iowa Writers Workshop. They had gone. And after going to the workshop, they had thought really seriously about how to make their yearbook one that was for everybody. She told me that in the 1980s, there was an enormous rift in the high school. There were the townies from Harlan, and they referred to the kids from the outlying areas as the colonies. There were the townies and there were the colonies. She didn't want that. She said what was happening was painful. It was deeply apparent that times were not good, things weren't right, and she wanted to make sure that it was a yearbook for everybody. She also didn't want to make up anybody's mind for them about the situation. She said, there's a refrain in it of, what do you think? You know, what's your opinion? She didn't want to answer that for anybody. So it's a really, really interesting farm crisis document. In fact, I'll tell you, I was out there at their historical society, sitting there with a stack of yearbooks in front of me, and I'm working my way down through, and I get to this one, and I look at the front cover, I think, gee, that's pretty. I open it up, and it says, something's missing. And I think, oh, something's missing. Empty hallway. Could it possibly be? Could it be? And I turned to the first page, and it was. This is about the farm crisis. 100% about the farm crisis. Every story linked back to the farm crisis. I about cried. I felt like someone had handed me the Holy Grail. It's an amazing, amazing book. And one of the things I want to go back to here for a moment. I know that they weren't thinking this, but black, gray, and purple are Victorian funeral colors. The theme is a funeral, whether they know it or not, which is, to me, a really powerful thing to see in this yearbook. So, story after story about what is happening to their community. Have you noticed the school is shrinking? The school budget is shrinking. The town is shrinking. There are 150 houses for sale in a town of only 5,000 people. After looking at this, I went and I looked at their newspaper. And it's stunning, page after page of houses for sale, businesses for sale, farms for sale. Wow. And the students were noticing this. They counted how many houses were for sale. What's it all about? And look at the pictures here. I think this is really visually beautiful. Now, of course, we've got the somewhat empty school bus, the person standing up in front of class, but then the naked tree, the dark naked tree. And it says, are we missing out here in small town Iowa? Is it all toil, humdrum, and drudgery? Is it nowhere city occupied only by corny farm folk? Do we occupy these seats only in anticipation of getting out of this hole and onto other things? Life is what you make it. Is something missing? You decide. And come back again and again to you decide. Hometown is a dead end. The sign, the very sad looking flag, the signs in the windows on Main Street. This one is so sad. The drive-in. Their only movie theater, closed and gone forever. And the seniors, going, gone. It's a very interesting discussion of what it meant to be a senior in Harlan that year. There's a discussion of the lack of jobs, a discussion of the general feeling of depression that everybody has. They quote the Chamber of Commerce, who says they'll be back. But the students writing this say they seem quite adamant about leaving and staying away. And like I said, I did interview the editor of this particular yearbook just to find out what she was thinking and what happened to her. And she's in Portland, Maine. She went to the University of Iowa. She trained as a speech therapist. She went all around the world. And when she got done going all around the world, she settled in Portland, Maine. She said, I had no intention of going back. That an awful lot of the kids in her high school class had made the same decision not to go back. But she had felt that the experience of the 1980s and how very difficult it was in that community made it hard for a lot of people to go back because there were a lot of bad memories associated with going through those years in that place. But to me, I think this yearbook, certainly more than any of the others, tells me, well, we had a particularly gifted group of young people putting this yearbook together, but the teenagers in the 1980s, whether they were telling their parents or not, were assimilating the bad news, were feeling it very, very deeply, and thinking about how it was going to affect where they were going to be the next year and the year after and a decade down the line. And it is no surprise to me that many communities like Harlan itself has managed to hang on to most of its population, but the colonies out there around Harlan have lost the vast majority of their population in the years since the farm crisis. But thank you very much for coming to hear my talk. I would love to answer your questions about this. What kind of questions do you have looking at all of this? Yes, ma'am.
I would bet the sponsors would have a huge, the permission to input, the guidance to put these things together, the flavor of these things.
I talked with, excuse me.
Like Amy's being out there.
Right. And I think that their sponsor had a lot of forbearance and a lot of acceptance for the things they were talking about. I talked with Beth, her name was Beth Ellsworth. I talked with Beth Ellsworth about this particular yearbook because, boy, it's deep and it's heavy, and the Chamber of Commerce sure wasn't going to like it. And I said, how did your sponsor react to this. He was a biology teacher. And she said he really wanted us to make it ours, that he really hadn't put any pressure on them to do anything in particular with it, but had been very willing, evidently, to sit there for hours while they hashed out whether or not, how they were going to go about addressing all of this. And I think in that case, it was a case of the sponsor providing the supportive ear that they needed to do something really original. I think the better and more supportive the sponsor, the more interesting sorts of yearbooks that you get. And I'm sure that he had a big role in them going to the writer's workshop and to them getting this education in putting together a really, really exciting yearbook. It's funny, the next year they go back to being, it's still a nice yearbook, but they go back to celebrating the team and football, basketball, all that sort of stuff. But this year, it was all about hardship, which you understand if you read the local newspaper.
Did this woman tell you what the response was to this when it came?
She said that people liked it, that they thought that it was reflective of their experience. I think it probably was a bit too raw to be repeated, but I was frankly amazed. I mean, I sat there flipping through it for the longest time, trying to soak up just everything they had to say. Back row.
The one thing I think was interesting about the Ames yearbook that you showed a little bit ago is how they're sort of harbingers. The one that strikes me is the driver's education. I'm a school teacher, and when I graduated in 1981 from Jefferson High School in Cedar Rapids, and driver's ed at that time was part of the school curriculum. There was no extra fee or anything like that. Schools, at least in Aiken, I suspect also have gotten completely out of the driver's ed business, and it's a cost shift to parents now. It's several $100 and $400, $500 whatever it costs. And that was, it's interesting to me, in 1983, they were talking about driver's ed being on the chopping block, and that was about the time the public support for those kinds of programs within the school began to erode, and now it's just not there at all.
That's right. And you could tell they were trying to figure out what can we afford, what can't we afford. And in Ames, it was clear that the cultural programs, they were going to be afforded, which I think is a statement about the kind of community Ames is. Yes, sir.
Well, I was wondering if you had any idea where the same teacher sponsored the yearbook the next year after this one. Maybe that's why it changed.
Good question.
School board and the Chamber of Commerce got rid of the sponsor.
No, I looked up his obituary. He did stay in the school, so he wasn't gone.
But
Yeah.
was he listed as sponsor?
I need to take a look at that again.
The community can react to
Right.
something even if the schools let them have it.
And, in a way, what they did was in fact reflecting the newspaper. So if people were upset about it, they'd have to be upset with just about everything in print in Harlan in those years, because it's just devastating to read the newspaper and think about it side by side with this, because the story was so hard driving back and driving past empty farmhouses that had been empty for a while and thinking, oh my gosh, when did they lose their farm? And it was really affecting to read their words, read it side by side with the newspaper, and think about how their world changed in a very short amount of time.
Are yearbooks surviving now?
Are they, David, are yearbooks, you've got a child at the high school. There's still an Ames High yearbook? Okay. Here definitely, in some places, I think, it's interesting, most college yearbooks have gone by the wayside. Those don't exist anymore. but the high school ones, and they're very flashy, artistic, you know, a lot of money put into them these days. David?
So, you know, after my partying years at the University of Chicago, I can only barely remember my high school years, and so I go back to my yearbooks from time to time, and to me the most interesting thing is often the comments scrawled by
Yes.
friends and acquaintances, and you hadn't talked about that at all.
And I would love to see how this one got annotated. All kinds of cheerful messages next to all the doom and gloom. And I would love to look at those, but people tend to be really careful about letting other people see their signed yearbooks. I mean, I remember from my years in high school, and I will admit I was in high school in the late 70s, early 80s, and there are messages in there I wouldn't want a historian reading. So it's hard to get your hands on, especially as recent as these, it's hard to get your hands on the signed yearbooks. But yeah, I mean, those messages add a whole nother layer that I would love to have for these yearbooks. Edie?
Well, I was just curious in the Ames one, I'm surprised they didn't talk more about drugs, because I went to United, and we were really nice kids, and we used to say, it's like Ames high, Ames high, Ames high gets high.
Well, I think there are actually some rather, they're pretty minor mentions. I think just because that might have been over the edge.
Alcohol was socially acceptable. But
Yeah, alcohol, well, particularly because in the early 80s it goes from being legal for 18-year-olds to not, which means they're in a transition point there where for some students it was in fact legal to drink. So yeah, I haven't seen a lot of references to drug use. Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about students appreciating the economic impact, but in Ames, the school district decided to get out of the driver's ed business. And it kind of became the rich kids and the poor kids, those whose parents were at the university and still had jobs, and those people who didn't have jobs anymore, because driver's ed, the cost of it tripled.
Yep.
And that was huge. I mean, like I said, and my children that were in high school at that point, they still talk about, look at those rich people. You know, that's
Yep.
kind of in their orientation.
Yep. And you don't see a discussion of that in the yearbook. It's very much from a single point of view, you know, that we all come from a point of privilege, which is what I find very interesting about the Harlan yearbook, is that they decided they weren't going to talk from a point of privilege. They were going to talk about shared hardship. Back row.
There's just one minor, you were in Kansas when this happened, so this is not, but Iowa actually raised the drinking age from 18 to 19 in 1978, and so it was 19 until
Okay.
1987, and then
Thank
it
you.
became 21. That's just minor thing, just
I was in Colorado, actually.
No, okay.
There-
Colorado.
there, 18-year-olds could drink 3.2% beer.
yeah.
You had to be over 21 to drink it.
Colorado.
Yes, ma'am.
Pam, all this information that you're gleaning from the yearbook, are you channeling this into the book you're writing now?
Yes. And I am right at the point, well, I'm at the point of my head exploding right now. I've got so much material, I'm going to have to decide what I'm going to do with it. I'm a social historian. It means I like to write about individuals and communities and families. So my book is not going to be so much about what was happening in the state legislature and about the economic side of the farm crisis, although I will certainly deal with that. But I'm trying to get a really good feel for what it was like to be an Iowan living through all of this. And I'm slowly gathering that up. I'm finding that it's much easier to get a handle on strangely enough, easier to get a handle on teenagers, on women's experiences. It is going to be very, very difficult to get inside the heads of a lot of farm men because they were so very good at building a sort of a barrier around themselves and not talking about hardships. It just wasn't part of their makeup to share troubles. But I'm finding a whole lot from women about their experience of those years. Yes, sir.
When you talked about Atoma and the plant closings and everything, you said that this is not the farm crisis, but
Well, it is, yes.
I mean, when John Deere, I was in the Quad Cities at
Yep.
that time, and John Deere was
Yep.
furloughing their plants. IH went out of
Yes.
business. I mean,
Yep.
and Hormel the same way. You're talking
Yep.
industries that are totally farm related.
And they don't connect it.
Okay.
We connect it. And very, you know, and there were implement dealers all over the state who were going out of business and small businesses going under and small towns going under. The students in Atoma didn't connect the dots. They saw the plant closing, but they didn't immediately connect that to what was happening in the farm fields at the edge of town. Yeah, I misspoke there, but yeah, they're not connecting the dots. Yes, sir.
Can you go back to some of your names?
Sure. Gotta get past Stratford. Rocky Horror. All right. What would you like to look at? This, I think, is the first. Yeah, that's the first.
Here, I was trying to read the caption.
It says bothered by the budget and then cuts per program. So they're talking about band on the one side and then driver's ed on the other.
I just thought I saw somebody doing it.
I thought there might be some people that you knew. I discovered that the daughter, excuse me, the daughter of a dear friend of mine edited the, I believe, 1986 yearbook. It was one of Andre Plotkin's daughters who edited that year. So I'm thinking I can perhaps interview her and find out what they were thinking from the perspective of Ames. I've discovered that LinkedIn and Facebook are great historians' tools, without which I would not have been able to hunt down and stalk the woman from Harlan, who was the editor of that wonderful yearbook. Excuse me. You know, without those resources, I wouldn't have had the foggiest where to go looking for her. It's a wonderful tool. If I want to find some of the people in the pictures that I found and the stories I found. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'll just comment. I graduated from Harlan in the 70s. And just to give a little context, the idea of the townies and the colonies, Harlan was the big town in the area, and then there's 7, I think, small little German Catholic communities around. And of course, their main income would have been mainly the farming. So when you think about a consolidated school district where that proportion of the population is affected directly from farming, I can see
Yep.
why it impacted the yearbook.
Well, it was really, really clear that this community had just been rocked by all of this. And, you know, Main Street,
Yeah, a lot of empty storefronts. I remember going back to visit home.
I mean, Main Street lived and died by the population out in the surrounding communities. And boy,
And yet it's some of the most fertile land. It's beautiful.
and oh, it's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. I've also wanted to be able to track down the stories of more schools that went under. I was really fortunate to find Stratford. Actually, I found Webster City first, and then discovered Stratford. And really puzzled the librarian when I came in one afternoon and said, I'm looking at your yearbooks. I know of other high schools that went under or were consolidated in those years, and trying to find the other yearbooks from Shelby County. They don't seem to be anywhere, so, excuse me, I'm gonna have to go back and search a little harder to try and find some of those. Other questions? Thank you so much.